All right. So today we're going to talk about pre-registering studies. My experience on this comes via registered reports initially. So I was on the first registered reports editorial board in Cortex in 2013 and have been part of the registered reports process for several journals and peer community and registered reports ever since. So I've edited and written quite a number of registered reports, and I'm drawing on that experience in formulating the ideas that I've had about pre-registering. Now, registered report is a slightly different thing in that you're writing when you write a stage one, which is a very full document. When you pre-register, you're writing something that, as I'll say, should be very concise. So that's something we'll talk about. But nonetheless, as I'll show you later, when you write a registered report, you also now, at least in peer community and in the journals we've influenced since then, write what's called a study design template, which is like a pre-registration. So you see very concisely what the inferential chain that you're pre-registering. And I'll explain all that as we go along. I'll talk for the first roughly half, and then Maxine will take over after that. When I say talk, I mean we'll make some points, but we'll have activities throughout. We'll have discussion throughout. So I'll say various things, and you might agree or disagree with it. I'm just giving you my thoughts, and Maxine will give her thoughts, and we can discuss it, and you can think about how that applies to your own research. So to get going, since we will be discussing things together, you might want to sit next to one or two people so you can talk with each other. Do you want to find some people around you? You've got at least one other person. Yeah, this isn't laid out very sort of workshop-y, but if you can... Yeah. Now, if you could introduce yourselves to each other. Yeah, work out to say each other's names. Say where you're from, and say what's your sort of main discipline. All right. Now you probably know what pre-registration is, but just to make sure we're talking about the same thing. So to pre-register means you go to something like OSF, Open Science Framework. It's up to you to do that. It's not mandated by any journal or anything like that. There's various templates you can have, and you write a short description about what you're going to do. You do this before data is collected. That then becomes time-stamped and set in stone. So once you've submitted it, that's what it is. You can only make it public after a certain period of time, but it is time-stamped for the time that you've actually said, and this is it. You then collect your data, you analyse it, you write it up as a paper, and you submit to a journal as you normally would. Yeah.
If, for example, use that template,
No one reviews it. So when you pre-register, no one reviews it. It's up to you what you do. You can be as sloppy, as detailed as you like. You can put down what you want. It's completely up to you. So that's in contrast to a registered report, in which is a journal or a platform like Peer Community in registered reports. You submit a stage 1 manuscript, which has a full introduction, a full method section, and an analytic protocol which should specify in complete detail what analysis you're going to do and what conclusions you'll draw given those analyses. That is reviewed, so an editor looks at that and sends it out to reviewers, and you go back and forth with reviewers and they say, no, I don't like this bit, do it like this, what about this? And you have a discussion and you collaboratively work out the best way of doing the study. And then when the reviewers and the editor have said, that's great, you then get in-principle acceptance, IPA, your stage 1 is accepted at that point. You then go off and collect the data. You then fill in the results section and the discussion. It's sent out for review again, ideally to the same reviewers, but not necessarily because of the nature of things. We can talk about that as we go along. I think going through the register reports process is maybe the only way you're going to write a proper pre-registration, because you get the feedback from the reviewers and the editor and make you think, oh yeah, I didn't think about that, or I didn't think about that. So I think that is one of the best processes of learning to pre-register. But hopefully this workshop will teach you how to do it, short of doing a registered report. But I would encourage everyone to do a registered report and go through a platform like Peer Community and Registered Reports, which is I'm wearing the T-shirt of. But it's slightly different in that the registered report the stage 1 is a full document specifying everything. I have seen pre-registrations like that, but a pre-registration shouldn't be like that, which is what I'll go through. It shouldn't be a complete document. But before we get to those details and why I think that and say that, which is sort of my opinion, as it were, but I'll explain why I have the opinions, and we can talk about that. Shall we just sort of set the stage so we know why we're doing what we're doing and the strengths and weaknesses of it? Could you just discuss in your groups why should we be doing this anyway? Why should we, like you say, it's unreviewed, but what you do in pre-registration is you say, I'm going to do this, especially the analysis part. You lock it in stone, and then you do your study and you do the analyses and you submit your paper as normal to a journal. It introduces some extra time, doesn't it? You have to think about the analyses before you do it. Academics are generally pushed for time, so why should we be doing this? Do you want to just think about that with your group and come up with the strongest answer that you can? If you just come in, sort of find the group you can use. I think I'm all right. I'll just stand there and talk. Thanks. Yeah, my right hand. Yeah. Backwards. It's tremor dominant part. And possibly amazing. The only thing, one thing that slows down is exercise. So, yeah. I'm obviously doing the right things. Yeah. At the open science conference, it's the nature of the on the science. So it's man to say this hand. Shaking like minus, yeah. When I get excited, so it's probably quite a scene. Eventually.
ChatGPT insists that spring in nature is an ethical journal. I asked for a list of them.
recommended is
Yeah.
the business.
So much for ChatGPT. Yeah. Honestly, not for profit. Honestly.
It's of society gaps and gaps in life sciences, psychology, for example, research. So make sure it's full of and then we've got double down with it, it's for profit. It's society journals.
No.
Did you ever listen?
I had a go at them, then I was pleased that she got a hammering from everyone else there, which wasn't my experience 5 years ago when the lecture person was there. I criticised them, and everyone's sort of all brown-nosing the lecture editor. For fuck's sake, opening scientists, then you was fine. So I was pleased to see 5 years later a complete change in attitude, yeah.
So she went to science.
Yeah, she was the only publisher there, so brave her. I mean, I respect her for that.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, any thoughts? What would be a good reason to pre-register? What would be a good reason to pre-register? Yes, to address the bias of positive results. It could also address the bias for negative results, because there are people who like to say there isn't an effect that doesn't replicate, and they can p-hack their way to negative results. So it addresses bias in general. It addresses, so what you might be thinking of there is the analytic flexibility that we all have. There's always many different ways of analysing a given data set to answer a certain question. If you did a multiverse of analyses and looked at the different conclusions they came, some will be more like what you want and others will be less like what you want. And if you work your way through that multiverse, through the garden of forking paths, saying, oh, this works a bit better, this works a bit better, you can get results that you want a lot of the time. So this is probably has been a huge problem, I think, within many literatures, and one of the reasons we have a replicability crisis. So it deals with analytic flexibility because you nail down the analytic protocol in advance. So a pre-registration would only be good if it actually did nail down the analyses in advance, right, in terms of that point. Does anybody else want to say anything else?
What do we do in a more exploratory?
Mm-hmm.
We lose a lot of flexibility. Pre-register protocol.
Yes. So you have a lot of flexibility. You have another sort of flexibility when you pre-reg. You can decide how confirmatory or exploratory is this research going to be. So you can still pre-reg exploratory analyses, but that you can sort of give yourself sort of more leeway, as it were. But people do pre-reg exploratory analyses. People do pre-reg qualitative analyses. There it serves a somewhat different function. For qualitative analysis, it's a bit like a positionality statement. You say, well, I want to say at this point in time, before I start the research, these were my starting assumptions, this is the way I was looking at it, these were my questions, this was my position on the topic. And it's still serving the function in some way of mitigating bias. So exactly how much you nail down that inferential chain is something that's up to you. If you want to make it completely confirmatory and to say, I want you to trust this result 100% as confirming this, then you'll nail it down rather thoroughly. If you want to say, I want to leave this a bit open, you don't nail it down quite so much. But there's some things you can do. Let's say you say, well, this is a fairly complex data set. I can't specify all the if-then rules. If this, I'll do this. If then, if this. You can do things like blinded data analysis. And you can pre-register that. And what you'd pre-register in that case is how you're going to blind the analyst. So what you do in this particular case is you create at least 2 data sets, and maybe up to 5, one of which is the real data sets. Another data set has had some key variable randomized. Say the category, the grouping people were from, or noise added in some way. And then the blind analyst goes through and comes up with an analysis they would be happy with for all the data sets, but they don't know which one is the real one. So that's another way of mitigating bias that's used by physicists. But what you could pre-register then is not the precise analytic method down to the R code that you're going to use, or whatever code you're going to use, but the way you're going to blind the analysis. So the basic function is reduction of bias, which may play out in different ways for different sorts of studies and your needs at a certain point in time. Does that make sense? I think very generally it's reduction of bias is what the pre-registration is meant to achieve. And I'll come to other sorts of bias, not just getting around p-hacking and analytic flexibility as we go through. Now, you've brought up a topic which we need to talk about, is what are the arguments against pre-registration? Do you want to just talk about that and then we'll discuss it? So in your group, just discuss, why you shouldn't pre-register. Yeah, I was an editor for a long time. Now all my PhD students do research students. Work.
Yeah. Maybe actually. I think they just don't like it.
But it's my laptops.
See what?
Yeah.
I went to get my laptop.
But I forgot to put in insurance. I blow it out. I just need.
Is it one? Just about the errors.
No, I won't change what I'm going to say though. So I think we'll just come out of discussion. Jana, who's here, she's done registration. No, she's good. She's done lots of reports. She's done basic analysis. She comes from religious studies, right? So hopefully,
Interesting.
yeah, she trained herself for all these things. Yes. Right, anybody want to say why shouldn't we pre-register? Not many people pre-register, I think, compared to those who do. Are there good reasons for this? I mean, you talked about exploratory. Maybe I've answered that. There's a further answer to that, which is when you pre-register, that's not saying that's all the only analyses that you do. It's just that you would have one result section that says pre-registered analyses. And then you can have another results section that says non-pre-registered analyses. That's absolutely fine. You're just being upfront about which ones you thought in advance and which ones you got after looking at the data. So people can take that into account in evaluating the evidential value of those results.
I was just thinking, pattern for application from EVA, from protocol, and then some reviews and something else.
Yeah, in fact, we found that. We pre-registered some analyses, and some reviewers said, and then we made a crucial conclusion based on a non-pre-registered analysis, and some reviewers said, but that wasn't even pre-registered. A reviewer, incidentally, that had never pre-registered anything in their life. So you're right, that can come up. Yes.
They are, and then maybe you can understand the report why they're listening in response to the film
look a bit more closely, so they have maybe you don't have any experiments pre-planned and you play it all.
Do you mean that some sort of work is best done in a highly interactive, quick back and forth with the data, with some real feedback? Yeah, so maybe pre-registration may not be. So you're arguing that pre-registration may not apply in that particular case. Yeah, so a lot of discoveries were not sort of planned in advance. That's right. You may want to do things you didn't pre-register. So I think that's part of the answer I gave over here, is that you may want to do things that were not pre-registered, and that doesn't mean that they are wrong to do. But the argument against it could be it might look like it was somehow you've weakened it by saying this was not pre-registered, whereas if you hadn't done anything at all, people just accept it more at face value. So I think that is... Sorry? Yes.
When you've got a human wither start experiment, and if this happened today, what would be really nice is to pre-registered replication.
Yes.
So we're poking around, we're selecting our neurons, and these ones are firing orientation. And then you repeat exactly what you did, and you check that these will be a really nice application.
Yeah, in relation to that, when I do a registered report, a more formal one, what I almost always do is do a pilot study first. Probably I'd pre-register the pilot study, though not necessarily. But then I'd think I don't have to. I'd feel pretty free to violate the pre-registration, partly because this is a pilot. Play around with it, and then the pilot study forms a basis for what would become the registered report, pre-registered study. So that would be the process. You might say that makes things more long-winded. You could have just stopped at what I'm calling the pilot study and got a good paper out. But bear in mind, we've had a credibility crisis for a reason. And it isn't just psychology. Preclinical cancer biology is an even worse situation than psychology in terms of the replicability rate and the effect sizes they get when they try and replicate studies. So I think, so my point of view anyway is we can't just keep carrying on what we have been doing. We need to change our workflow in certain ways. And it is true, as you said, sometimes that is held against you, but I just say, at least I can do it right, and if you want to be cynical, I know you're being cynical, you know you're being cynical, the editor will know you're being cynical, so I put up with this sort of problem. And I think it will happen less and less, because more and more people are now aware of pre-registration, and we take those sorts of criticisms with a pinch of salt. Anything else anyone wants to add?
What percentage of studies are pre-registered?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It would vary discipline by discipline. I have a general policy in my lab of pre-registering. Sometimes we don't. It just sort of slips by, particularly for pilot studies. But it's just a general thing. We'll try and get out that pre-registration and just make it a habit. But I'd say within my department, there are a few people who do that as well, but majority of people don't do that.
Very competitive stuff, the same structure, do you think it can be mentioned for fear of being scooped?
So fear of being scooped, there's also an argument against preprints, which I also preprint everything. But my personal view on that is when I've written a pre-registration, I have a public time-marked document saying I got here at this time. So I actually feel safer having pre-registered. If that isn't sort of good enough for you, because that won't trump a Nature paper, as it were, that came out before yours, you can when you do the pre-registration on OSF, you could say only to be released after this date, but it's still time-stamped. I personally, I'm just not worried about that. I just think I actually feel safer. Same with preprints. Before I submit any paper, I preprint it, and then I actually feel way better about scooping, because there it is. It's in black and white. I did that work. My lab did that work, and it's there. Okay, so based on what I've been talking about, what we're trying to do with the pre-registration is to control bias. And we want to control bias because there's inferential flexibility, which you can capitalise on after the results are in. So what you want in a pre-registration is to state clearly the inferential chain that goes from the theory that you're testing down to the conclusions that you're making. So in the pre-registration itself, what you're trying to do is to just make clear the components of that inferential chain from theory to conclusions that need to be set in stone to eliminate bias. That means you don't need things like a full introduction. You don't need things like a full method section. In fact, those things can be a hindrance, because if someone wants to check that you did what you said you're going to do they have to read 5 pages of a pre-reg in order to try and work it out? That is cognitively very demanding. If you have a very short pre-reg, you can easily check, did the person do what they say they're going to do? So the moral of that is, say enough to tie down inferential flexibility, but no more. Because then the pre-reg can serve its function of being a quickly checkable document that allows people to see that in your results section, you did all and only in the pre-registered results section what you said you're going to do, that you had tied down inferential flexibility, and here it is. If you have to wade through a ton of stuff to get there, it's going to be very difficult to check. So if you look up pre-registrations and Simmons, they give guidelines for pre-registrations, and that's one of their key points is to make it concise. I have seen pre-registrations which include sort of full introductions, motivations, methods, and so on, and that's very difficult for a reviewer or anybody else to work with, to check, for the pre-reg to perform its function of tying down inferential flexibility. Now, you say in a registered report you do have all of those things, but then what we've added in the latest iteration of registered reports, starting with peer community, is, as I said, the study design template, which I'll show you, which gives, even for a registered report, which is a full document, a very brief, concise layout, concise, where you've tied down the inferential chain so anyone can check at a glance. In fact, when I edit or review registered reports or read them, that's what I'm checking. I'm checking the study design template against the results sections and the conclusions that are drawn, because that's a really quick way of doing it. I'll show you an example one as we go through. So because it does this, because what you're going to specify, and I'll go through the theoretical claim that there's actually at stake that you're testing, the prediction that follows from it, the precise test that tests that prediction, and the possible conclusions that follow from that test in a concise way. You've laid bare the sort of the essence of the scientific process that's going on in that study. So in some ways, this could be, you could say, an argument against a registered report, because when you have to think that through and state extremely concisely and simply, this is exactly the theory this is the claim that's being tested, this is the prediction that follows from it, this is the exact test that tests that prediction, these are the exact conclusions that would follow from different outcomes of the test, you're sort of exposing yourself in a way to how clear, rigorous and justified was that inferential chain. You can't hide behind verbiage when you do that. So that is both the disadvantage, because sloppiness and waffle become exposed. But of course it's an advantage because it forces you to think through these things. So now we're going to go through that process, and I want to start with something I think very few people think about. It might sound a bit grand at first, but it's actually very simple. It's just making explicit parts of the scientific process that are often implicit in the work that people do, but if you give it a moment's thought, you can clarify certain things which are essential to the scientific process, namely the relationship between theory and prediction. So now what I'm presuming here is there's a little bit more going on than saying, let's test a bunch of effects, see which effects are there, and then spin a story around them. So that's sort of that's a sort of scientific approach you see in many disciplines in psychology that I react against a wee bit myself. I don't think that's how you get cumulative knowledge growth, because nothing actually builds up from that. All you do is you find some results, you spin a story. But then the next person who comes along just does the same thing, finds some results and spin a story. There's no way knowledge can accumulate by this process. And I think one way we might deal with this is just that what requires a little bit more thought, but people aren't generally used to it, is to ask ourselves, what is actually scientifically at stake here when this effect is shown to occur, to be present or not be present? So I'll give you some examples of my thinking. So here's something you see at the end of many introductions. We predicted that. I predicted that. Now this is something I'm sure if you go back to my old papers you'll see, but I stopped doing a little while ago because I realised it's scientifically a sort of a misinformed way of going about it, because what it makes it sound like is what's at stake is your ability to divine nature, to predict what's going to happen, as if what's at stake if this effect happens or not is your genius in divining nature. But that is scientifically, your genius in divining nature is actually irrelevant. Right. So what I like to write at the end of an introduction is something like, on the theory that, blah, 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 this follows. So what's shown to be at stake is some theoretical claim and not my divine genius. Now, it might be the case that I predict some of these predictions or I don't predict some of those predictions, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter what my personal confidence is for and against certain predictions. What matters is what theoretical claims are at stake if these predictions come out or not. So let me give you some examples, because I think it's, in a way, a sort of fairly straightforward matter. We just need to think a little bit. So I've been running some student projects I'll just tell you about, so there's a concrete example. So I was interested in Buddhist meditation, and I saw that mindfulness had been extracted from the Buddhist tradition, and you get mindfulness meditation, but in a secular form. But if you'd asked sort of Buddhists before the mindfulness thing exploded, what is Buddhist meditation about, they wouldn't have said it's about mindfulness. They would have said it's about the self, and realising that there is not a self, though intuitively you feel you are a self. In fact, there is no such self, and the whole function, in fact, of the defining nature of the Buddhist school is the no-self school, and mindfulness is a tool for reducing your sense of self. So I thought I'll create two interventions, both drawn from genuine Buddhist meditation. One where you strengthen the sense that there is a self that owns experiences and has experiences and is above and beyond the experiences. And another one that weakens that sense of self and one that strengthens that sense of self over a 2-week period of daily meditations, and a control group. So this was the design. So there's some intervention that is meant to weaken the sense that you are a self that has experiences. Naturally, you need to ask, did it weaken? Did it do the job? Did it weaken the sense of self? So there's a sense of self question there. There's a mindfulness question there. Would like the two interventions to engage mindfulness to the same extent, so there's no confound with mindfulness. And then there's some substantial outcome that might come out of this, for example, the persistence of one's emotions, and anxiety, depression, and other things. So, what hypotheses might one list at the end of the study? Well, you could say, we predict that the strengthening intervention will increase scores on the sense of self questionnaire compared to the weighting list control. Okay, but what is wrong with that statement? Well, it says we predict that. And I just said I don't like that. It doesn't matter if you predict it. You might think the intervention is hopeless and will never achieve the task in 2 weeks. You might think it's fantastic. But it doesn't really matter, does it? It doesn't matter what you think about it. What matters is what it actually does. Yeah, but I prefer to... So I asked my project student I explained the situation and asked him to phrase it. And he was a really good student. He got a first, which is in the UK is, you know, the highest one. And he said, based on the Buddhist concept of anatta, no self, participants in the weakening will weaken and strengthening will strengthen their sense of self. In this case, it was for weakening. So this was my feedback to him. I said, well, yeah, we are it's sort of true. The reason why we're doing this is that the Buddhists have an account of no self. But that's not what's really at stake if this prediction fails. Right? So what's at stake? It's a manipulation check. So based on the theory that the weakening intervention weakens the sense of self. It's just as simple as that. So that way of phrasing it says what's scientifically at stake here is the manipulation check. Did the manipulation do what it was meant to do so we can even get off the ground and test the main theory that we want to test about strengthening and weakening self. So there's nothing grandiose about this. Do you see what I mean? It's just saying, what's at stake here? Well, it's a manipulation check. So if this prediction fails, the manipulation doesn't do what it says on the tin. And so that's the way I've tried to phrase it here, to be clear. It doesn't matter if we predict it or not. I might think, that was a damn good intervention, I'm sure it'll work. I might think, I'm sure it won't work. But it doesn't matter, does it? Who cares? What matters is whether the manipulation does what it says it does, and that's what's scientifically at stake. Incidentally, I'll just mention it because I often see this as an editor. Notice the word significantly in there. I often see people phrase hypotheses with the word, this intervention will significantly increase this, or this will be significantly correlated with this. This is wrong because a hypothesis is about the population. A significance is a property of a particular test and whether you pass the test or not. If your hypothesis is there's a significant relationship and you find a significant relationship, you have 100% not made an error. You couldn't have made an error, could you? Because you said it would be significant and it was significant. But you can make mistakes. The way you'd make a mistake is if we say in the population there is a relationship and we got a significant result, that would be a type 1 error. So the hypothesis just mentions what the population is, that there is a relationship between these two variables, or this affects that. That's it. You don't use terms like significance when you state a hypothesis. So I just say that because I come across it so often, but it's a category mistake. You're mixing properties of a particular sample test with a population property when you say that sort of thing. All right, so he also, as I say, is a good student, so I'm not trying to put him down in any way by using his examples, but his attempt to apply what I was just saying about theories and predictions, I find experienced researchers do as well when, as a registered reports editor, I'm asking people to state their theories. So this is why I continue to use these examples. So based on support from investigations in neuroscience, or based on the literature, or based on Smith and Blogg's 2005, we hypothesise that. So this is a common phrasing. But that's not what's scientifically at stake. You have what hasn't been claimed here, what hasn't been stated here is a simple proposition, a claim that is at stake if the prediction fails. That's what you want to be clear about. So in this case, it was that the weakening and strengthening meditations would promote mindfulness to the same extent. Now, the reason why I wanted that was because I wanted to show there's more to Buddhist meditation. There's something more interesting about it than just mindfulness. There's this business of addressing the sense of self. And maybe that could have beneficial or harmful outcomes independent of the mind cultivation of mindfulness. So I did want, it's true, as part of the experimental design, we wanted mindfulness to be the same. But what's at stake is not investigations, but it's on the theory that both interventions train mindfulness to the same extent. Again, it's just a phrasing of a manipulation check here. Do you see what I mean? So what you're trying to do is to say what's actually at stake if this prediction fails. This is the claim I'll give up on, and this claim plays an important role in the nexus of claims that constitutes this experiment and what it's trying to achieve. So when I say stating theory, I'm not saying you have some grand theory of human nature necessarily. I'm just saying you're stating what's at stake for this particular prediction if it fails or passes. And all it requires is a little bit of thought about what's at stake. Why are you doing this? What's the function of this test in the web of inference that constitutes this study? So now one of the reasons why I was doing this study was thinking about maybe if you reduce a sense of self, the sense that I am the same self as I was 5 minutes ago, 1 year ago, 5 years ago, that could change how persistent emotions are. Because if, for example, emotions are at least partly constituted by appraisals that about the relevance of a situation to the self, but you become a different self and not quite the same self over time, then your emotions should persist less over time when you weaken the sense of self, including anxiety and depression, but including pride and happiness and positive and negative emotions. That was my thinking. So he said, based on Buddhist principles, something like based on Buddhist principles of equanimity through recognizing impermanence. But that isn't what we would give up or have counted against if this prediction failed. No one would say that we had attacked the very foundations of Buddhism with this particular experiment. So I thought, based on the theory that emotions or appraisals about an enduring self might be more specifically give a reason why we're making this prediction. But then I thought, no, we're not going to give up appraisal theory just because of this one study. So you see, it takes a little bit of thinking. What are you actually going to conclude from this? And think in advance about it. So what you're trying to nail down is not just analytic flexibility in the stats, but all of your inferential flexibility. To be clear, you know when you read studies a lot and you get some interaction comes out versus some main effect, and they say, and this supports the theory, just because there's something to do with the theory. Do you ever get frustrated by that? Yeah, I see some people nodding. So this is the bias that this aspect of the process is trying to eliminate and nail down. Let's be clear in advance the relationship between theory and predictions. So that bias is also addressed by the pre-registration or registered report, as well as the p-hacking analytic flexibility bias. So I tried this, based on the theory that weakening the sense of enduring self will affect emotions, viewed in part, at least in part, as appraisals about an enduring self. I thought I would let the results count against that. That does make more sense to me as a claim that could actually be at stake. Now, you might agree or disagree with that, but I hope you see the process I'm trying to go through here in grappling with this. I'm trying to be clear and state a proposition, a claim, that is actually at stake and I'm interested in. I mean, why the hell am I doing this study? Just to get another effect? No, who is interested in some other effect? For scientists, we're interested in relatively general claims that people can build on so we can have a cumulative science. And that's what I'm trying to do. Not necessarily by doing anything very grand, but just by being clear about what I think, what's the most general claim I can come up with, which I think really is at stake, depending on the outcomes of the study. And I think if we just think about it a wee bit, we can address some of the problems that many literatures are facing, and pre-registration registered reports helps do that. Did that make sense to people? Does anyone want to give me pushback or agree or ask questions about it? As I say, this is sort of personal. I'm not sure if you went to a pre-registration workshop by anybody else, they would say anything that I've just said in the last half hour. So this is sort of my take on things, so you're quite welcome to disagree. I'm just giving you the reasons why I think certain things, and I hope they resonate, but you can do what you will with them. Here's an example of, this is a real pre-registration that's said, phenomenological control, incidentally, is the ability some people have, many people have, most people have, in fact, to construct experiences that misrepresent reality but have a feel of realness to them. For example, me making my hand feel so light that it rises in the air by itself, as I'm doing now, or to create hallucinations that fit your needs. So, theory, phenomenological control evolved to promote experience of a spirit world in order to support religious beliefs. Prediction, the tendency to have experiences indicating a spirit world, past life recall, out-of-body experiences, contact with the spirit world, depends on phenomenological control ability. So you see that's, we say, the theory we came up with. Now in this case, I think it's a reasonably grand theory, I think. And indeed, if we found no relationship between phenomenological control and tendency to have out-of-body experiences and these other things, I would reject that theory, or at least it would be severely counted against. So I'm quite happy to say this is the theory that's at stake here. It's not a matter of me predicting that prediction. Who the hell cares if I predict it or don't predict it? What matters is that theory. Because if that theory is supported, then that's a great theory for other people to work on and do more stuff with. Okay? So that's the idea. So, why don't you now... you can either think of a research question you're working on. Presumably you come here because you're either thinking of pre-registering something, or maybe you've done some pre-registrations. If you've already done a pre-registration, that might be the easiest thing to think about now. If you haven't, think about something you might pre-register. And what I want you to do, you could concentrate on one person for the time being in your groups, and just think of how you might state something along the lines I've just talked about, based on the theory, the claim that's actually scientifically at stake. Then, what's the prediction that follows that, if it was refuted or confirmed, would actually have a bearing on that more general claim that's at stake, that's of scientific interest? Does that exercise make sense? You know what I'm asking? Good. So in your groups, discuss it. Yeah, that was, I think, it was my mother who used to ask my legs, used to bend her body. And she talked to spirits. So I was obviously grew up with that, so I was rather intrigued with that, which motivated this thing. We're running this keeps posted. Yeah, and we did find nice relationships with out of context. People didn't know that we were relating it. Out-of-body experiences, it had a, if you plot realness of some past experience of this, the body of its phenomenological control, there is a reasonable intercept actions and a nice slope. So phenomenological control is an explainable of it. But it does claim a good path. Well, past life recall would seem to explain all of that. In the sense that there's a zero intercept and there's a nice slope. And there's plenty of scattering. So some would say it doesn't explain that. But I could just say, well, it's nice. Most people are. I mean, 80% of them are, 70% of our participants have only one of these antibody. To some degree agree on this. To have it fully within this line. So it's the whole spectrum.
What do you think? I'm surprised you don't think that.
All my mum did, but and then, for instance, the 1 year, I mean, 2 PhD students regularly have the body talks.
That's the experience, right?
Yeah, so they saw them, they were watching things,
Yeah.
but they, as far as I know, they didn't give you that. So I'm ashamed. But the experience, in full, seems 100% real. It's only, you know, it's only lessons. So was I applied to do it. It came to the the APU was still, but I don't like it.
And run away.
Yeah, it's like classic to me. Here now, he's had 2 or 3 antibodies. Since one was when he was interviewed for his job at Sussex. Stuart Sutherland was interviewing Tony was smoking, and then he suddenly saw himself. Talking to Stuart on the conversation. He thought to himself, that makes him burn his fingers. What's now? I think myself that means that. Because in those days, yes, so that's what you got. You really was right.
Yes, nobody has hearing.
Don't you agree on this?
It is astonishing.
Usually the points of the study is kind of that this.
Yeah, exactly. No, I know. People just don't think of it. And yeah. All I want to do is get them thinking.
Then if that one where so people create 2 different
All right. So I'm not sure if you could solve this problem in the time available, but I just wanted to get you thinking along those lines to plant a seed, so that if you find this a valuable way of thinking, making explicit all aspects of the scientific process, so this is something you take out of this and apply. Any questions? Does it make sense to people as a way of thinking? Yes. So the question is, do you call it a theory? Yeah, what do you call a theory? That's what I wanted to say. I'm not trying to say something grandiose. I just want to say, what's the claim that's a bit more general than the prediction that's really at stake here if the prediction fails? So one way of thinking about it is to think, what's the most general claim that's at stake here? There must be at least one most general claim that's at stake if the prediction fails. It's not to do with this particular dependent variable, this particular intervention. There must be something a bit more general than that, right, than purely the statistical hypothesis that constitutes the prediction, or something close to a statistical hypothesis. The more general that is, the more interesting it is. So another way of putting this is, do you want your research to have impact? Well, the more general the claim that's put at stake that you're proposing here, I'm willing to make a bet that's more impact your research will have. If you just say there's this statistical hypothesis, there's this one, and these came out, that's not going to affect the field so much as here's a more general claim that was at stake in this study. And the thing is, there must be a more general claim that's at stake. You just have to think about it. Whether you call it a theory or not doesn't really matter. But if I could take a theory to be, one way of thinking what a theory is here is sort of something that could be refuted, or at least, if not refuted, have evidence count against it because of the study that you're doing. And the more general that claim is, the more interesting it is, and in fact, the more falsifiable it is, the more general it is. So the better science you're doing, then you specify it.
I can follow you so far. I have an objection about the kind of embedding of the claim in theory. It's, especially in consciousness science, we don't have well-established theories. Sometimes we need to develop them.
Well, here's consciousness science, and I try to make this is as, you might think, as flaky an area as possible, out-of-the-body experiences, past life recall. This isn't perceptual psychophysics. So here, but I've still tried to say is, what's the general claim? So here's another one we had. We tried to think of an experience people could have that's somewhat unusual, that isn't produced by phenomenological control. That's sort of a positive control condition. We thought the experience of flow. So here's the theory. Flow arises from absorption in a task over which one has a suitable level of mastery. There's no need to create flow for other reasons, for example, for reasons to create them because of your phenomenological control abilities. They'll either come about because you're mastering a situation, the right level of difficulty, or not. So that is the claim I would give up if that prediction failed. I also do work in subliminal perception. William James described the unconscious as a tumbling ground for whimsies. So I'm dealing with the most flaky, stuff you can think of, and if I can come up with theories and test them, I think anybody can. That's my position. Okay, testing. Now we've got to test the claims. And one question to ask yourself is, now if you're going to pre-register, you sort of feel the pressure of the following question: what is the simplest and or most robust way of testing your question? And exactly what is the test that will test the prediction? When you pre-register in advance, this question suddenly forces itself upon you. I think about it, psychologists, I'm not sure how many psychologists are here, but psychologists are beloved of what you could call multi-degree of freedom tests, like a one-way analysis of variance or a two-way analysis of variance, where you have several degrees of freedom, like you've got several conditions. And what you're testing is, somewhere in here, there's some pattern of differences. What an omnibus test, or a multi-degree freedom test, tests, the question is there some pattern of differences here? It doesn't tell you what the pattern is, it's just saying there's some pattern of differences. Now, some pattern of differences will rarely be the test of the prediction that you made. What you have to do is you have to break down that multi-degree of freedom test into one degree of freedom tests. By 1 degree of freedom, I mean you're testing whether something goes up or goes down. It can either be big or small or zero. If there's something that can be big or small or zero, that's 1 degree of freedom. A regression slope, it can be positive, negative, or zero. That's 1 degree of freedom. A difference between two groups, this can be bigger, or it can be no difference. There's 1 degree of freedom. Or a contrast, the average or weighted average of this compared to the weighted average of this. That's a contrast. An interaction is a difference of differences. If it's this contrast is different between this group and that group, that's an interaction contrast, but it's 1 degree of freedom because it can be bigger and it can be smaller. Now, typically, not always, but typically, a prediction you made from a theory will actually be tested in the end by a 1 degree of freedom test. So let me show you what I mean by that. And another point on this slide is you could have a lot of if-then rules, like if it's not normal, I'll do this. If it is normal, I'll do this. Or why not just do robust tests from the beginning? Then you can pre-register it, and it makes things far more simple. So to go back to the example I was talking about, to test the hypothesis that a sense of self will be affected, say that the strengthening group will strengthen the sense of self, and another hypothesis would be the weakening group will weaken the sense of self. We'll conduct a 2 time pre-intervention, post-intervention time 3, the 3 groups, analysis of variance on sense of enduring self. Now you often see this in pre-registrations. They say, we'll do this 2 by 3 and over. They might be a bit more specific and say, we'll look at the interaction. Now, what is wrong with that? What is wrong with that is you haven't nailed down your degrees, analytic degrees of freedom. Because that is a multi-degree of freedom fact. That means there's a pattern of some things could be doing this, other things can be doing this, something else could be doing this. Well, in this 2 by 3, there's 2 degrees of freedom. So there's 2 independent ways of going up and down and side to side. You haven't nailed it. What pattern is going to count for or against the hypothesis? Under what precise conditions do you give up each of those hypotheses? You haven't said. You've got tons of analytic freedom here. So if you go through a registered reports process, they'll say, you've got to specify this more clearly. That's why going through a registered report is useful, because the habits of people in thinking this through have not quite developed yet until they've been through registered reports, typically. So this is what I'll do. I'll take the difference between pre and post, in the sense of an enduring self-score, say between strengthening group and the control group, and do a t-test on those different scores. That's 1 degree of freedom. It's an interaction contrast. It tests the interaction. That's precisely the interaction in 1 degree of freedom contrast that tests whether the strengthening group strengthens the sense of self. Okay? So I don't even bother with the omnibus Hanover. Why bother? I specify this hypothesis, this test. This is the test of that hypothesis. That's it. It's as simple as that. This is the precise test, and I'm committing in advance. If I get good evidence for H0 from this, I'm giving up that hypothesis. That's the way I think about this. I don't know if you came up with a precise prediction in the previous exercise, but if you did, or you came close to one, think about the 1 degree of freedom test that would actually test it. Just to clarify, are you happy with what I mean by 1 degree of freedom? It means you've come up with a quantity that can be bigger or smaller. If you have 3 groups, the mean of 3 groups, it can't just be bigger or smaller, can it? Well, this could be bigger than that, but this could be smaller than that. There's a pattern there. So if there's a complex pattern, it's not 1 degree of freedom. 1 degree of freedom is there's something that goes up and goes down. That's it. It's 1 dimension. 1 degree of freedom is 1 dimension. And a degree of freedom test can be chi-squared. It can be over any sort of type of data, and it can be any weighted average of this set of conditions and this set of versus this set of conditions. But you end up with a quantity that goes up and down. Just have a go at that, just to think about it. I don't expect you necessarily to solve it, because we're trying to think through a whole scientific process here. But I just wanted to get thinking along those lines to prompt you to do more of that in the future. I don't have much more. Yeah, I see. We can break. I'll talk for another 2 minutes. We'll take rate for times. This is all stuff as ever constant. Right. But yeah, that's right. We find that if we run with it, it's not. Yeah. Yeah, having an external point of view.
The most severe ones, what kind of impact?
Yeah.
And if that's the word.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I know sometimes I get a spread, of course. Definitely. Sometimes you get so focused on something else that's more major. Anyway, yeah, just
I think yeah.
We can buy your house. Specific for time.
all right. Sorry to interrupt. I hope he got you thinking, and that was worthwhile thinking about it. But we'll just push on. I just want to make one other point, and then I think I'll have made the points that I'm making over and over and over again as an editor of registered reports for many submissions. What I've been going through is, and what I'm about to go through is stuff that I look out for and frequently have to make points about. So one thing almost every submission I have to talk about is how do you get evidence for no effect? Because what 99.99% of almost any literature has, it was non-significant, therefore there was no effect. People were non-significantly above chance, therefore people were at chance. There was a non-significant interaction with gender, therefore there was no interaction with gender. But this is all completely unjustified. It's ubiquitous. You might know it's unjustified, but it's so ubiquitous it's hard to stop yourself thinking along those lines. But non-significance by itself is never a reason to say there was no effect. It doesn't provide that evidence. Because non-significance is quite consistent with there being too much noise in the data for you to have any evidence at all, or not much evidence, or enough evidence to draw any conclusions one way or the other. Now, how much noise was too much? Well, there's a certain amount of noise, and what you're trying to do in science is look for a signal that's hidden by the noise. Now, is a signal this big? Well, then you can see it through the noise. If it were there, you would have seen it because it would have been this big. Well, is it this big? Well, if it was there why would you see it? It's tiny compared to the noise. So you can only say you have evidence against something being there if you had some idea of what size it was that it could have been if it were there. And that's a scientific question that no statistician can answer for you, and no standardized effect size of 0.5 or 0.2 can be the answer to, because it's a scientific question. So I think of it as the pragmatics of statistics, which is the interface between the science and the statistics. Now, there's two ways of looking at this. There's several inferential systems you could use which claim to justify the conclusion that there was no effect. Significance testing is part of the system of hypothesis testing that Neyman and Pearson argued for in the 1930s, which has sort of become the orthodoxy. What you're meant to do with that, and if you do Neyman and Pearson properly, is do a power calculation. And that is to control the error of missing out on something that you're interested in. But if you want to control the error of missing out on something you're interested in, you need to say what it is are you interested in and make sure that you have the power to pick up any effect that you would be interested in. Well, that's just to say if you're doing power, you need to say what's the smallest effect of scientific relevance. Most people don't sort of think that way or know that that's what they're meant to be doing. And you need a scientific reason that's peculiar to the scientific context that you're operating in for why this is the smallest effect of scientific relevance. There's no general statistical reason for that. So you need to come up with a scientific justification for why this is the smallest effect of scientific relevance for your statistics to have relevance to the scientific theories and claims that you're testing. So this is a difficult question to address, but you have to address it if you want your statistics to be relevant to the scientific claims that you're testing, and for you to have a scientific case to say, I'm justified in saying there's no effect here. Now, there's another way of saying there's no effect, which is to say there's a null region, not a point null, but a whole null region of effects, which are so small they're not of scientific relevance. And then you see if your confidence interval or credibility interval falls within that region or is completely outside that region. That is called equivalence testing when you're using frequentist statistics. But there's the Bayesian equivalent if you use credibility intervals. There you have to answer the same question as power, which is to say, what's the smallest effect of scientific relevance to define the null region, which is the set of effects which are not scientifically relevant. Now, another way, which I find far more useful myself, is Bayes factors, because what turns out, if you're doing multi-lab data collection, you've got thousands of data points, you do need to answer the question about minimal effect sizes. But if you're not doing these vast sorts of studies, what turns out to be most important for a Bayes factor is the effect that is scientifically characteristic of that situation. What's the effect that would be predicted in that situation given the scientific context? That is a far easier question to answer than the smallest effect of scientific relevance. But if you're going to use Bayes factors and you want the Bayes factor to be relevant to the scientific claims that you say are being tested, then the characteristic effect that you're saying, the effect size you're saying is characteristic of the situation, must be relevant to the scientific situation that you're dealing with. So you can't use default Bayes factors to do that. So all of this is to do with what I call the problem of the pragmatics of statistics, is that we need to think far harder than almost anyone does about the relationship between the science and the statistics. And since 2015, this is precisely what I've been doing. So as I was sort of saying before, if I can do it for the flaky work that I do, then anybody can do it. So to severely test a theory, you need to be able to show it is wrong. That is, you need a method by which support can be given to the null hypothesis as well as H1. So what do you pre-register? Well, let's take a two-group t-test, weakening versus control, will be conducted on the post-pre difference in the sense of enduring self-scores. if we're going to do a base factor, we need to say what change in sense of self could a 2-week meditation intervention produce? This is a scientific question, as I said, and you might need scientific evidence to answer it. Well, let's say people had looked at experienced Buddhist meditators and they had a lower sense of self than matched controls by a certain amount, m. Well, surely that's the maximum I could expect in a 2-week intervention. This helps me do a base factor because then I know that whatever effect I get is going to be somewhere between 0 and that maximum. And maybe half of that is extremely roughly what is predicted. So then what I would pre-register is the fact I'm doing this t-test, and then this is the prior, as people say, or the model of H1. And what I like to do is to give a little reason, because this is what these authors found in these conditions. Simmons et al. Actually say for pre-registrations don't give any reasons because it's irrelevant to nailing down inferential flexibility. I think if you can give a reason in a short clause like that, it's extremely useful for evaluating the analyses. So I do put in that reason. That's for a base factor. For power, you want to say something like power was 90% for the t-test with n equals 25 per group, assuming a minimal effect of interest of Cohen's d of this. How could you get a minimal? What would be a scientifically justified way of getting a minimal effect that's plausible? Well, there might be a previous literature that you can draw on. You don't pick the size of effect that was found in the previous literature because that doesn't define the size of effect that above which is what you're interested in and don't want to miss out on. That effect is smaller than the effect in the literature. What you don't want to miss out on will surely be smaller than the mean effect in the previous literature. So one recommendation is you take the bottom limit of a confidence interval, or credibility interval, on a previous study, pilot study, a meta-analysis. I'm not the first, I'm blanking the authors who suggested this. They had suggested a 95% confidence interval. That is often gives you tiny effect sizes. I think an 80% confidence interval I've come to think is sort of reasonable and workable for doing this. Now, so what I've been going through now is a sort of a big part of the reform that many fields need. It's very difficult to think through. This is a paper I've written on how to get these effect sizes, either minimal ones or predicted effect sizes. So I hope that's clear. That's the whole tutorial in itself. So I'll just say there's an issue there to think about. If you're doing a registered report, certainly if it goes through certain registered report editors, you'll be pushed back on this to think the issues through that I just spoke about. Now, there's a final bit of inferential flexibility I want to mention before we take a break, which is to be clear what pattern of results would confirm or refute each hypothesis. This is something I also, as an editor, often need to push people back on. So they say, we'll do these tests, and they might mention, if it's just one test, it might be clear if you get support for if the test comes out significant or it's a high base factor, you conclude one thing, otherwise you conclude something else. But it can be a wee bit more tricky than that. And thinking through, would you really say your prediction is refuted or confirmed based on these outcomes, can be enlightening and help you reformulate what are the tests you're actually going to do. That can really help. So I'm just going to give you one last exercise before we break. So this is a real example. I was talking to someone last week, which is why this came to mind. So she said she had some visual stimuli of different degrees of complexity, and there were two theories in terms of preference she was interested in. One theory predicted a U-shaped relationship between preference and fractal complexity, and another theory predicted a linear relationship, maybe not strictly a straight line, but at least monotonically increasing, and certainly if the high complexity should be greater than the mid, should be greater than the low. So I just want you to think about now, what test or tests could you do that actually would test each of these hypotheses? Just give that some thought. You can talk about it in your groups.
Yeah, in a way.
Yeah, that's the first thing I thought of, do a linear training, and I thought, actually, if I do, well, you could just do the linear training. Yeah, I thought about it. That would be, I can imagine patterns where there's, for example, there's a U shape that's like shift. There's a linear trend that goes down and then up a bit higher on one side. That will give it a linear trend. Or you can have a U shape that would be there's still one on top of it. You just have a bit of flow. Apparently there was. So that's why we've raised it as a bit of a she wanted low, higher than mid, lower than high, with one piece. Okay, so let me just say some things. First of all, you might just pre-register, I'll do a one-way ANOVA. Preference as dependent variable, condition as the independent variable, pre-register it, Bob's your uncle. But that wouldn't be right, would it? Because that goes back to what I was saying before. A one-way ANOVA on this has 4 degrees of freedom. It just means there's some pattern in there. But what pattern? Which theory is right? Or are they both wrong? You wouldn't know. So that's not the crucial test. So then I thought, well, you could test for a linear trend, polynomial coefficients, and a quadratic trend. But then I thought, I said, well, I could get a quadratic coefficient, but that could just mean there's some curvature in it, but it's still monotonically increasing upwards. So the existence of a quadratic trend wouldn't actually confirm theory one. I checked with my interlocutor, and she said, no, that wouldn't. What I need is the low ones are here, then it goes down and then for the mid, and then it goes up for the high. She said she needed that. Test the theory. And a quadratic trend wouldn't refute theory two because, as I said, it could still be monotonically increasing upwards. It just means there's a bit of curvature in the line. So that's not the test. So then I suggested, okay, you see, talking with her, it seemed that we could make a three-way distinction, as I've drawn here, between low, mid, and high. And this did seem important to her based on her knowledge of the literature and where the theory was coming from and what she was testing. So if we tested a t-test low versus mid, and a t-test mid versus high, these two t-tests, those joint t-tests would together test the two theories. Because for the linear one, we would need the high greater than the mid, and the mid greater than the low. So if those two tests came out in that direction, she would say the linear is supported. If not, it's wrong. I don't accept it. And the pattern for the U-shaped one is this is higher than this one, and this one is lower than this one. She said if you got that, that's theory two. If not, it's theory one, sorry. If not, that theory is refuted. So it took a bit of talking, but in the end I could boil it down to, given her scientific context, to two t-tests, and that did give me definitive rules for saying which theory was right and wrong. It turned out when the data were in, both theories were wrong, but that's nice. It's always nice to falsify some theories. But you see, what I want to illustrate by this is it actually helps to think in advance. Hang on a minute. It would be easy to say I'll do polynomial trends. That was my first instinct. But actually, when I thought about which theory would be supported or refuted, there are all sorts of patterns where that wouldn't do the job. So actually thinking about what you're going to conclude from your statistics helps you get the right test that will actually test the hypotheses. That's the point. So now, I just wanted to show you something. I've put a link here. You can get my slides if you want the slides. Or you just go to peer community in, registered reports, study design template. What we do when we do a registered report is these things I've been talking about. This is a slightly simplified version. Is you have, for each theoretical claim that's a test and the prediction that follows, you have a row in a table. And you see the inferential chain that I've been talking about is nailed down in a very simple way that anybody can refer to and say, this is what's at stake, this is the prediction I'm going to use to test it, this is the test I'm going to use, this is the interpretation. Right? Quick. And then you can check that against the results section that comes out and to say, did they do all the tests in that table and only the tests in that table for the pre-registered results section? So now here's a good habit to have. You often see people say, this was a pre-registered study, but then you go to the results section, you don't really know what was pre-registered and what was not pre-registered. That's bad form. So just as you would in a registered report, do your pre-registration, then say, this is the pre-registered results section. Have all and only the pre-registered results. This is the non-pre-registered results section. And then you're free, if it's just a pre-registration, you're free to draw on whichever results section you want to draw on most if you give arguments for why you're going to do that. You might have said the pre-registered results turned out not to be relevant for this reason, but there was a really good reason we're going to use these non-pre-registered results, and then you do that. That's absolutely fine. You just give a reason for why you're doing it, though, and people can evaluate the strength of that reason when they read the paper. So this is sort of what I mean about laying bare the essence of the scientific process in all its faults or not. This shows how strong is the reasoning all the way down from theory to conclusions. And it helps you, I think, for me anyway, it helped me clarify the whole process. And now it's something I would do every time. In fact, when I submit to the ethics application, I'll often put in study design template, just so I've got it done even when I submit ethics. I then get feedback from ethics, but they can see the scientific process laid stark when they're evaluating the study and giving it ethics. So before we wrap up, shall we have a 10-minute break? Get some coffee? I've just been rabbiting on for an hour and a half. Maxine will take over after this and go into more detail specifically about more complicated experimental methods you might be using within consciousness research. Anything anybody wants to say before we take a break? Yes. Our robust t-test is it involves trimming, say 20% trim either sides of the distribution. Often if you say R for a robust t-test, you'll do what's called Windsorizing. It trims off the 20% extremes. You can adjust it, the 20% is sort of a default. And then it fills in the missing data with what was at that percentile that you have left. So if I'm going to trim everything below this point, I fill in below the point with the data point that was here, likewise above. And then you do an automatic correction for inequality of variance, regardless of any test of inequality of variance. You do those both things. So that means you sort of it covers yourself pretty well against most violations of normality. So if you say you're going to do that in advance, then you don't need to say your analysis is conditional on any assumption checking. So it just simplifies the process. Okay, back in 10 minutes, and Maxine will take it from there. Thanks very much. Screen capture in progress.
Screen capture in progress.